In the spring of 1832, a man arrived in Bombay with nothing but a name that had once meant something. David Sassoon was 40 years old, a refugee from Baghdad, where his family had served as treasurers to the pashas for generations. But the old world was collapsing. A new governor had seized power, one who saw the city's Jews not as partners but as targets. David's father had been imprisoned, tortured, then released only to die shortly after. The choice was simple: flee or face destruction. So David gathered what remained of his family and sailed toward British India, toward a port city where empires were being built on credit and cargo, where fortunes could be made by men willing to see opportunity in chaos. Bombay was a fever dream of commerce when he arrived. The British East India Company had turned it into a trading hub, a place where cotton, silk, and opium moved through warehouses faster than governors could regulate them. David understood something fundamental about this moment. The old powers were fading. The Mughals were shadows. The British were hungry. And between them stood merchants, middlemen who could navigate languages, currencies, and cultures. He spoke Arabic, Persian, Hebrew, and enough English to negotiate. He understood credit, contracts, and the unspoken rules of trust that made distant transactions possible. Within months, he had established himself as a trader. Within years, he had become indispensable. But it was opium that changed everything. The British had discovered something monstrous and profitable. China would pay almost anything for opium. Silver flowed from Chinese ports to Indian warehouses, and the trade became the financial engine of the British Empire. Opium was grown in Bengal, processed in Indian factories, shipped to Canton, and exchanged for tea, silk, and silver that returned to London. It was a cycle, elegant and terrible, and David Sassoon positioned himself at its center. He didn't grow the opium. He didn't force it into Chinese hands, but he financed it, transported it, and built an empire on its flow. By the 1840s, the Sassoon family controlled a network that stretched from Bombay to Shanghai, from Calcutta to Hong Kong. David's sons were stationed across Asia, each managing a branch of the family firm, each fluent in the languages and customs of their territories. They dressed in traditional Baghdadi robes, kept kosher households, observed the Sabbath, and conducted business with a discipline that earned them respect and suspicion in equal measure. Europeans called them the Rothschilds of the East, a comparison meant to convey both their wealth and their otherness. But the Sassoons were building something different. They weren't banking dynasties, lending to kings. They were merchant princes, moving goods across empires, exploiting the gaps between laws, languages, and loyalties. The First Opium War erupted in 1839, a conflict born from Britain's refusal to accept China's attempt to stop the drug trade. Chinese officials had seized and destroyed thousands of chests of opium in Canton, an act the British government treated as an assault on free trade. War followed. British gunboats shattered Chinese defenses. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 forced China to open 5 ports, cede Hong Kong, and pay reparations. For the Sassoons, this was not a moral crisis. It was an expansion opportunity. Hong Kong became a Sassoon stronghold. Shanghai followed. The family built warehouses, docks, and offices in every port the treaty opened. They hired agents, translators, and enforcers. They moved opium faster and more efficiently than anyone else. David ran the operation with a patriarch's absolute authority. His sons answered to him. His clerks feared him. His competitors respected him because he never promised what he couldn't deliver and never delivered late. He built synagogues in every city where his family operated, not as gestures of piety, but as statements of permanence. The Sassoons were not transient traders. They were building a dynasty. and dynasties required institutions, traditions, and the appearance of legitimacy. The family maintained their Baghdadi identity even as they expanded across continents. They wore traditional dress in public, conducted business in multiple languages, and kept their households separate from the European colonial society that surrounded them. This separation was strategic. It allowed them to move between worlds, to be trusted by local merchants who saw them as fellow Asians, and by British officials who saw them as reliable intermediaries. The scale of the operation was staggering. By the mid-19th century, Sassoon ships carried tens of thousands of chests of opium annually. Each chest contained approximately 60 kilograms of processed opium, enough to supply thousands of users for months. The logistics required to move this volume were complex. Opium had to be purchased from British-controlled auctions in Calcutta, transported to Bombay, stored in climate-controlled warehouses, loaded onto ships, sailed through pirate-infested waters, smuggled past Chinese customs officials, and distributed through networks of local dealers. Every step required capital, coordination, and contacts. The Sassoons excelled at all three. But opium was not the only business. The Sassoons understood diversification long before it became a principle of modern finance. They traded cotton when the American Civil War disrupted global supplies, buying raw cotton from Indian farmers and selling it to British mills at prices that tripled overnight. They financed textile factories in Bombay, turning the city into an industrial center that would eventually rival Manchester. They invested in real estate, purchasing vast tracts of land in Bombay and Shanghai, land that would become the foundation of those cities' modern skylines. They owned ships, warehouses, and trading houses across Asia. They financed smaller merchants, extending credit at interest rates that guaranteed profits regardless of whether individual ventures succeeded or failed. But opium remained the core, the engine that generated the capital for everything else. David Sassoon died in 1864, one of the wealthiest men in Asia. His funeral in Bombay was attended by thousands, a display of the influence he had accumulated over 3 decades. His sons inherited an empire, but they also inherited a problem. The world was changing. The British government, under pressure from reformers and moralists, began to question the opium trade. China, humiliated and resentful, was slowly organizing resistance. Public opinion in Britain was shifting as missionaries returned with stories of Chinese suffering, of entire populations trapped in addiction, of social structures collapsing under the weight of the drug. And the Sassoon sons, educated in British schools and increasingly integrated into British society, faced a choice their father never had: whether to remain merchants of the East or become gentlemen of the West. Abdullah Sassoon, David's eldest son, chose tradition. He remained in Bombay, managing the family's Asian operations, maintaining the traditional dress, the religious observance, the patriarchal authority that had defined his father's reign. But Elias David Sassoon, a younger son, broke away. He established his own firm, E.D. Sassoon and Company, and began to pivot toward respectability. He moved to London, bought estates, donated to charities, and positioned himself as a British gentleman of Jewish faith, not a Baghdadi merchant. The split was not hostile, but it was complete. 2 branches of the family, 2 visions of what the Sassoon name should mean, 2 strategies for navigating a world where the source of their wealth was becoming increasingly controversial. The most transformative figure was Albert Abdullah David Sassoon, known simply as Albert. Born in Bombay in 1818, educated in London, Albert was a man of 2 worlds. He inherited his grandfather's business instinct, but understood that power in the late 19th century required more than wealth. It required access, titles, and the appearance of refinement. He cultivated friendships with British aristocrats, financed political campaigns, and donated generously to causes that earned him visibility. He funded hospitals, schools, and public buildings. He collected art and rare manuscripts. He hosted dinners attended by cabinet ministers and members of the royal family. In 1872, he was made a companion of the Order of the Star of India. In 1890, he was knighted. He became Sir Albert Sassoon, the first of his family to carry a British title, a transformation that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. But Albert never abandoned the source of his fortune. Even as he built mansions in London and entertained the Prince of Wales, his ships continued to move opium through Chinese ports. By the 1880s, the Sassoon firms, both branches combined, controlled an estimated 70% of the opium trade into China, a monopoly so complete that prices and supply were effectively determined by Sassoon decisions. Chinese addiction rates climbed. Conservative estimates suggested that by the late 19th century, between 10 and 20 million Chinese were regular opium users. Social structures frayed. Families collapsed under the weight of dependency. Provincial governments struggled to maintain order as addiction drained productivity and tax revenues, and the silver continued to flow out of China, destabilizing the currency and impoverishing the interior provinces. The moral cost was not invisible. Missionaries and reformers railed against the trade, publishing accounts of Chinese suffering, of men wasting away in opium dens, of children born addicted, of entire villages consumed by the drug. The British public began to feel uneasy. Parliament held hearings where officials defended the trade as essential to Indian revenues and British prosperity. The Sassoons, for their part, argued they were simply merchants responding to demand, that banning the trade would only empower smugglers and criminals, that they employed thousands and contributed to the prosperity of British India. It was a defense used by every industry built on human suffering. We did not create the demand. We only met it. They pointed to the legality of their operations, to the taxes they paid, to the infrastructure they funded. They positioned themselves as victims of misplaced moral outrage, as if the law itself absolved them of responsibility for the consequences of their commerce. The beginning of the end came not from morality, but from politics. China, after decades of internal chaos that included the devastating Taiping Rebellion, began to stabilize under the Qing government's late reforms. Anti-opium movements gained strength, supported by a growing nationalist sentiment that framed the drug as a tool of foreign domination, a poison deliberately introduced to weaken Chinese civilization. In 1906, China launched a domestic campaign to eradicate opium use, destroying poppy fields and closing dens. The government offered treatment programs and imposed severe penalties on dealers and users alike. The British government, facing international pressure and the prospect of losing China as a trading partner, agreed to phase out the trade negotiations, resulted in a 10-year plan to gradually reduce opium exports. By 1917, the opium system that had enriched the Sassoons for nearly a century was officially dismantled. But by then, the family had already transformed. The wealth generated by opium had been redirected into textiles, banking, real estate, and finance. The Sassoon mills in Bombay employed tens of thousands of workers, producing cotton goods that competed with British imports. Their properties in Shanghai became some of the most valuable in Asia, including the famous Cathay Hotel, a symbol of cosmopolitan luxury that hosted everyone from Noel Coward to Chiang Kai-shek. In London, the family had become fixtures of high society, intermarrying with British aristocrats, collecting art, funding museums, hosting salons attended by writers, politicians, and royalty. They had done what all great fortunes eventually attempt. They had laundered their origins through respectability, transforming the proceeds of a morally questionable trade into assets that appeared legitimate, permanent, divorced from their source. The most visible symbol of this transformation was Siegfried Sassoon, a grandson of the Bombay branch, who became one of Britain's most celebrated war poets. He fought in the First World War, earned the Military Cross for bravery, then became a vocal critic of the conflict, publishing poems that condemned the generals and politicians who sent men to die in trenches. His work, raw and unflinching, captured the horror of modern warfare in ways that shocked and moved the British public. It had nothing to do with opium or trade, but it made the Sassoon name synonymous with British culture, with literature, with moral courage. It was a kind of redemption by association, a way of saying that whatever the family had been, they were now something else. Siegfried himself seemed largely unaware of the source of his family's wealth, or at least he never addressed it in his extensive writings. The fortune that funded his comfortable upbringing, his education at Cambridge, his ability to write without financial concern, remained unexamined in his work. But the original fortune, the engine that made everything else possible, never fully disappeared from memory. In China, the Sassoon name remained synonymous with foreign exploitation, with the century of humiliation that preceded the Communist Revolution. When the Communists took power in 1949, they seized all Sassoon properties, viewing them as symbols of imperialist oppression. The family's extensive real estate holdings in Shanghai, worth millions, were confiscated without compensation. In India, their legacy was more complicated, a mix of gratitude for the jobs and infrastructure they provided, and resentment for the profits they extracted. The mills they built became symbols of both industrial progress and exploitative labor practices. In Britain, the family was absorbed into the aristocracy, their origins treated as exotic backstory, their wealth as simply wealth, no longer tethered to its source. What the Sassoons understood, perhaps better than anyone, was that empire is not built on force alone. It is built on the ability to move goods, manage credit, navigate legal systems, and position oneself between supply and demand. They were not conquerors. They were intermediaries, the kind of figures who thrive in moments of transition, when old orders collapse and new ones have not yet solidified. They saw the British Empire not as an ideology, but as an infrastructure, a set of ports and laws and currencies that could be used by anyone willing to learn its rules. They were refugees who became billionaires by understanding that power in the modern world flows through trade routes and financial networks, not through titles and land alone. The question that lingers is not whether the Sassoons were good or evil, a binary that history rarely supports. The question is what they reveal about the systems that enabled them. The opium trade was not a rogue operation. It was official policy, sanctioned by governments, taxed by administrations, defended by armies. The British government derived significant revenue from opium sales, using the proceeds to fund colonial administration in India. The Sassoons were extraordinarily successful, but they were not unique. Dozens of firms participated. Thousands of officials facilitated it. Millions of pounds sterling depended on it. The Sassoons simply did it better, more efficiently, more ruthlessly than anyone else. They built tighter networks, maintained stricter credit terms, moved faster than their competitors, and understood markets in ways that gave them decisive advantages. Their story is a reminder that fortunes are rarely clean. They are built on moments of leverage, on access to capital and markets that others do not have, on the ability to act when others hesitate. The Sassoons acted. They moved faster than their competitors, adapted quicker than their rivals, and built an empire that lasted generations. And when the world changed, When the trade that made them wealthy became indefensible, they changed with it, transforming their wealth into something that looked respectable, permanent, inevitable. They invested in industries that employed thousands. They funded hospitals and schools. They became patrons of the arts. They married into aristocracy. They produced poets and philanthropists. And slowly, over decades, the source of their wealth faded from public memory, replaced by the visible results of how they spent it. In the end, the Sassoons became what all great dynasties aspire to be: a family whose origins are remembered as history, not scandal, whose wealth is accepted as simply existing, whose name carries weight without anyone asking how it was first earned. They controlled 70% of the opium that flowed into China, financed an addiction that devastated millions, and built mansions, mills, and monuments with the proceeds. And then they became British aristocrats, Indian industrialists, and celebrated poets. That transformation, more than any single transaction, is their true legacy. Not the wealth itself, but the alchemy that turned it into something else entirely. It reveals how fortunes are made, how they are justified, and how they are ultimately forgiven by time and reinvention.